For one-time maths teacher Virginia Fatetis, one number mattered most.
She was a very sexual person. She was a multi-orgasmic person.
Virginia was somebody who was used to getting attention and caring from men using her sexual prowess.
I love you so much.
If she liked men so much, why did she kill one? Probing the mind and the timeline of killers, this series reveals the red flags of those who will one day be investigated for taking a life.
Can you just call my ex-husband and tell him what's going on?
Jim Faulkner was impressed at the woman that he'd come across online.
It said the total package, and she had a facade that she was a corporate woman. She was successful. She was vibrant. I mean, we played sports together. We could do mountain bike. We could do all these things together.
What the profile did not say was that Virginia had something else in her rich character tapestry.
Virginia had a very strong jealous streak, and she really needed to be the number one person in anyone's life to feel special.
Home for Virginia was the Mount Olive area of New Jersey. It was in that neighborhood that Jim and Virginia had their first date.
We met at TGI Fridays, and we had a few drinks, a couple appetizers, and I didn't know if it was going to go anywhere from there. And I walked her to her car, and I told her it was a pleasure to meet her. And she said, "Where are you going?" She goes, "You got to give me a kiss." And she didn't hold back from there.
I think Virginia knew that where she wielded the biggest power was by wielding her sexuality. And so she was willing to do whatever it takes, be the person who is a sexual risk taker, throw herself at men, just so that she could get that kind of attention.
She knew how to get in there and get you pumped up, and I felt pretty cocky at the height of our relationship. I felt pretty like I'm the man.
Dr. Judy Howe is a forensic psychologist who has been analyzing the motivations of a woman who would one day be tried for murder.
Virginia is the kind of person who knows how to butter you up and who knows how to make you feel good about yourself, and in that way you might be very attracted to her in the beginning. But if you cross her in any way, and sometimes it's not clear what would make her upset or angry at you, then you don't know what's going to happen. She's unpredictable in many ways.
Well, I thought she was pleasant. She was attractive. She made you feel like you were the only person in the room.
Personable, sexual, and smart too.
Virginia Fatetis was a bright woman. She had worked as a school teacher, and her kids really loved her. But before that, she'd actually worked for AT&T in their IT department, information technology. She decided she really wanted to help kids, so she decided to take this teaching job.
As he got to know her better, Jim learned of Virginia's past.
She had revealed that when she was 7 years old, that her parents and her brother, the father who was in the military, had abandoned her and the family and left the state and never came back. And I think that abandonment followed her through. That rejection really had an impact on her.
When you think about her childhood where she felt abandoned by her father, and she really didn't have any positive male figures who were consistent in her life. And it would make sense that as she grew up, she really felt like she needed to get attention from men specifically. And she very quickly figured out that if she could make herself sexually available, tell these men how wonderful they were in bed and how awesome they were and pump them up, that they would give her the attention that she so desired.
What Jim did not know on that first date was about Virginia's multi-partner past.
Marriage number 1 ends in divorce. Marriage number 2 ends in divorce. Marriage number 3 ends in divorce.
Virginia, through my opinion of her fear of abandonment issues, she always had to have a man on deck.
Jim would meet her former men.
When I met her second husband, she told him that she's gonna marry me. That's the man that she's gonna marry. There's your replacement.
Indeed, that's how Jim became husband number 3 to Virginia Vatetis.
She was still legally married, and I was still legally married when we met. She handled all the legal paperwork for my divorce, my previous divorce. So she said, I'll take care of that for you. She wanted me divorced because her divorce was on the way. So she handled all the paperwork, processing. I didn't need an attorney. Done.
Just who he was getting in bed with, Jim Faulkner could not have known. As husband number 2 had predicted to the man who would become husband number 3, husband number 4 was just around the corner.
Well, after about the first 6 months, when the warm and fuzzies started wearing off, she said, I have to talk to you. And the job at the time, I was working at least 10 to 12 hours a day, and it was it took a lot out of me. And she said that she wasn't feeling it, that I wasn't giving enough to the relationship. And she took a lot of trips with her kids. She said, I'm going down the shore for the weekend. I'm going, which I, at the time, thought that was normal. So already in the first 6 months, the signs were not good.
That sort of sexual spontaneity that she had and the sort of brazenness that she had that people are first attracted to could also be the downfall of a person who doesn't realize that Virginia now doesn't like you. And you don't ever know when she's going to strike or what she's going to do.
She ended up confessing to me that she had already met somebody else. And I asked her, I said, well, if you want to be with that person, go do so. I won't stand in your way. I'll respect it. But she said, no, I still want to be with you. I said, well, then you have to end whatever friendship you have with this other person right away.
It would become clear that Virginia was not about to end the friendship, or others for that matter.
I woke up one morning, and I had my foot, I had some clothing on my toe, and I picked it up. It's a man's underwear in the bed. I said, what the heck is this? Oh, that was my ex-husband's. It got mixed up with the laundry with my son. Oh, okay. Another point in time, I wake up in the morning, and there's a man standing at the top of the bed when I open my eyes. And I said, who the heck are you?
One partner wasn't enough. One person wasn't enough to satisfy her need for attention, essentially, and she needed to continually get that validation from multiple people to feel good about herself.
It was a rough period, and I wanted to end it there, and she couldn't take rejection. So when I ended it, she ended up sending 120 roses to my house. She bought me gifts and cried and put on a whole show that she didn't want to end it. Still was keeping me on that string, even though after going through this.
So Virginia goes back on Match.com. She'd been there before. That's how she met her last husband. So why not try it again? So she sees Patrick Galuli on Match.com. She thinks he's kind of cute. So she sends him this little emoji, and they start chatting.
We were still involved when she met him. So really, I said, I saw her emails about, wow, it was a good weekend. And I go, are you involved with somebody else? She goes, no, what are you talking about? I'm not involved with anybody else. What are you, nuts? And so again, she had to have the layover where she had to make sure she was locked in with Patrick before she pushed me away.
When Jim next raised the subject of her cheating, he got more than he had bargained for.
I told her that if this gentleman that you're seeing is still not going away, I'm moving out. And that's... So I go to sleep, and all of a sudden, I wake up and feel a hand in my neck. And she grabs my neck and tells me to get out of her room. I can't sleep in her bed. I'm leaving. And I really felt uncomfortable and unsafe.
To Virginia, Jim was now dispensable. She'd moved on to Patrick.
They start chatting online for a while. This goes on for a few months. And then they start dating. And she's really intrigued by this guy. She really likes him.
In 2008, Jim Faulkner took the decision to leave. A decision which left him with nothing.
I'm done. So she said, okay, I want you to sign this paper. It means I relinquish all equity, monies, finances. I just take my personal property, or my personal effects and go. And I said, well, I don't really like your attitude right now. And I think we need to speak with, get legal help and go over this. And she goes, if you don't sign this, I'm going to call the police and say you tried to hurt me.
Virginia Fitetis is not a woman who likes to be told no.
I said, you're out of control right now. My son and I get in my car. I take off down the street. She runs down the street, jumps on the top of my car. The windows are open and puts her hands and trying to be like Superwoman and lasso my car. And I stop. She tuck and rolls on the ground. And it just was a disaster. So I park the car. I help her up. And she goes, you need to come in here right now. I go to the house. And she goes, sign that paper right now. So I didn't want any trouble, so I just signed everything away and pretty much walked away from it.
Now Virginia had it all, the house, the money, and more importantly, a new love interest just over the river in New York with retired cop and bodyguard Patrick Gilhooly. Brian Harris is a former murder squad detective.
Patrick, he enjoys life. He likes wine, women, and song. This is a guy who's done his time on the streets. He has this second career in life, protecting others, but he's also enjoying life. This is a guy who he can do it, so he's going to do it, and he's dating women.
Patrick was somebody who I think didn't think he had an allegiance to anybody and didn't think anybody deserved his allegiance. And so in that way, it was pretty difficult for him and Virginia to get along if you even think back to the beginning of their relationship, because Virginia, due to her need for constant attention, would require a lot more from Patrick than Patrick was willing to give her in the first place.
He's a retired NYPD officer. She'd been married to a cop before. He had worked briefly as a celebrity bodyguard, and now he's running his own security company. And she says he's really a gentleman, and she doesn't see that a lot anymore. He opens her doors for her. She likes the way she's being treated.
Patrick Gilhooly was falling for a dangerous woman.
She always told me she had a dark side. I never knew what that dark side was, but she said she had a dark side.
Was her dark side one, which meant she was made for murder?
Law enforcement in general had already gotten the story from the daughter that something was up, something was awry, there had been shots fired. He even said to his daughter on the phone, she's shooting at me.
In 2008, when Virginia Fitetis began dating Patrick Gilhooly, the feisty woman was fooling around with a live-wire man.
Both Virginia and Patrick are very impulsive people. They are people who don't really seem to think things through and act out of emotion.
As time goes on, she says she starts noticing that he can be abusive, especially when he's been drinking. And Patrick does have a tendency to drink a lot and a little too often. But she claims that when he does, he kind of throws her around, and he also gets jealous.
Possessiveness becomes an ever-present part of their relationship.
She talks about some trip they took to Las Vegas together, and she says that when he sees her at the pool chatting with a couple of guys, he gets so mad that when she comes back to the hotel room that he just shreds her bathing suit. He's just so angry, so jealous.
Meanwhile, Virginia suspects Patrick of cheating. She confided in the man she had left.
She had revealed some things, that he, was a chronic alcoholic and he was a nasty drunk, and he was running around with a lot of different women on Match.com, apparently.
I don't think Patrick was somebody who really thought of himself as a one-woman man. I think he thought that he deserved to be with multiple women at one time.
At one point, Virginia figures out how to sort of follow Patrick as he's opening his phone, and she figures out his passcode. So she gets into his phone, and she sees these text messages with some woman. So she goes on Facebook, and she sends this friend request saying, "Who are you?" And Virginia says, "Let's chat." She says, "I'm Patrick's girlfriend." And she says, "Now, wait a minute. Patrick told me that you two had broken up." Virginia says, "Broken up? We just had sex this morning."
If she is provoked, she will do whatever it takes to establish herself as the alpha, as the ringleader, as the rightful person who is entitled to Patrick. And certainly we see that she has done that over time, threatening other people she thought Patrick was involved with, hacking into his devices to check out what he's doing. There was absolutely no trust in this relationship, and there was a lot of volatility.
He goes wild, and he gets so angry, and he's sending her these horrible text messages, and he sends her this voicemail, and he calls her a psycho, and he says, "Hey, psycho, look, I am so done with you. You are such a complete psycho. It is over. I'm out of here. Good luck, psycho."
This level of volatility and this level of instability essentially gives us a peek at what is possible in this relationship and how quickly things can escalate without warning. I think the two of them probably escalate one another. If one person is very angry, the other person's going to become very angry as well. And because they continue to be involved, there's really no line, it seems, where somebody does something and the other person says, "That's it, I'm cutting you off forever."
She was so obsessed with Patrick, so obsessed with him, that she made a picture of him, her screensaver on her phone. This is a woman who does not want to let go of this relationship.
Patrick, however, did want to let go.
Patrick's old school. He's not going to break up via text. He's not going to break up via phone. Because men, in Patrick's era, we do things face to face. It's the right thing to do.
Virginia won't accept that Patrick has dumped her. She sets about changing his mind.
She was so keen on getting his attention no matter what that she essentially escalated upon her own behaviors in a series of increasingly more desperate texts just to get him to respond in some ways.
She actually told Patrick that she had MS. When the sympathy card didn't work, then she tries sex. And she's trying to lure him with pictures of her. She texts pictures of her in like sexy new lingerie and, offering to him a good time.
She tried to use her sexuality, sending him provocative photos. She tried to present herself as a sexual mystery and something sexually adventurous would be awaiting him if he would just contact her, to also even saying, if you're with somebody and you're serious, fine, but if you're not, then why not?
She's actually kind of portraying it as friends with benefits so that he doesn't necessarily feel like he has to commit, but we can be friends with benefits.
She's spelling out these elaborate fantasies and talking about their memories in a very provocative way to try to get his attention. So I don't think she minded that she would have to be the person to do more of the work as long as she could get the attention she needed.
It was on March 3rd, 2014, just after 6 o'clock on a lovely spring evening, when Virginia texted Patrick to head on over.
Patrick originally tries to end it nicely, if there's a nice way to end a relationship with Virginia. He is going to talk to her, spend the evening. He's going to be that gentleman.
Around 7 o'clock, Patrick comes over. When he comes over, he's got a suitcase that he's returning to her because she has loaned the suitcase to him and he just wants to give it back. So they're sitting on the sofa, they're watching TV. She's wanting a little something, and she tries to have sex with him, but apparently it doesn't work. He's not able to perform.
He's watching TV with her. Perhaps maybe trying to get the courage up to say, hey, it's over. But he gets a phone call. And he leaves. And he goes outside.
He's on the phone with his new girlfriend. And he's apparently just saying, look, I'm going to go in and just end it with her once and for all.
What happened next depends on whose story you believe. Murder by a woman, or a case of kill or be killed.
According to Virginia's story, he's so angry that he slams that storm door and breaks the glass. Comes in the house and he's belligerent.
She goes crazy. She starts yelling at Patrick.
I think Virginia got to the point where she realized she was losing her grasp on Patrick, and that perhaps he wasn't that invested in her anymore, and that he was losing interest in her, and that scared her. And perhaps there was a thought that flashed through her mind that if she couldn't have him, nobody else could.
And Patrick says, look, Virginia, I'm kind of done with all this. My daughter, by the way, she thinks you're a psycho. Psycho? What? Well, at least I pay my taxes, she says. That's a hot button issue. Because as it turns out, this has been an ongoing thing between Patrick and Virginia. Virginia has been sort of threatening to turn in Patrick because he hasn't been paying taxes on his security business.
She's going to report him to the IRS for income tax fraud because she knows he hasn't reported all of his income from all of his secondary side jobs and security jobs that he has had. This sends Patrick into a rage. He's furious. He can't believe it that she's going to bring up this kind of garbage because it's been a speed bump that he thought he had already dealt with. And now she's throwing it back in his face.
When Virginia threatened to report Patrick for tax evasion, even doing research on how to do so, I think it shows how far she would go just to get a person's attention, even if it was negative. And certainly psychological research shows that when somebody wants attention, any attention is good attention. So if you can't get positive attention, getting negative attention is better than nothing.
The couple's relationship was toxic, and it had the potential to turn lethal. Patrick, the ex-cop, still owned his service revolver, and it was often nearby.
Patrick is somebody who is always on the lookout for any potential danger because of his history and his work as a police officer. And I think he also knew that he was flirting with danger with the way that he was living his life, and that perhaps there would be people who were angry with him, not just women, but just people in general, and that he needed to have a weapon nearby just in case somebody came looking for him.
It was March 3rd, 2014. The couple had been seeing each other on and off for 6 years. She suspected, correctly, him of multiple infidelities. He suspected, correctly, that Virginia had seen other men. They had split, got back together, and then split again. Virginia wanted Patrick to agree to reconcile. Both volatile, both potentially drunk, and there was a gun in the house. How far would Virginia's passionate nature take her? Was Patrick Gilhooly's life in danger? At 9:38 p.m., Patrick Gilhooly made the first of 3 911 calls. Virginia was frightening him.
What does Patrick do? He wants it on record. He wants somebody to hear just how crazy and irrational Virginia is. So he calls his daughter. And while he's on the phone with his daughter, explaining this play-by-play,
Patrick calls his daughter and he says, "Oh my gosh, you are so right. Virginia is such a psycho. She's beating me right now. She is attached. Can you hear?"
His daughter can hear the screaming, the yelling that's taken place. What is going on with Virginia yelling at Patrick is confirming what Patrick's daughter already told Patrick. I think she's a nut. You need to get away from that woman. And Patrick knew that from previous conversations he had with his daughter. So what takes place? Through all this yelling that is going on, Patrick lashes at Virginia, but lashes at her verbally. And he says, "My daughter told me you were crazy."
And then the phone hangs up. Then the phone rings again. And the daughter doesn't hear anything but sort of scuffling around. She doesn't hear, there's like nothing really intelligible. You can't make it. So it's probably a pocket dial. So then there's a third phone call. And by this time, what's going on in Virginia's house? By this time, Virginia's so angry. She runs. She says she's scared. She says that she sees a look in his eyes, and it terrifies her. She finds this gun under the mattress.
He's walking up the stairs, and the next thing his daughter hears is, "Holy blank, expletive, expletive, she's got a gun." And then 3 distinctive gunshots is what Patrick's daughter hears. And then the line goes dead.
I think she realized that she did care about Patrick to some degree, and that she really essentially killed him out of an act of desperation because she had felt so rejected and she couldn't deal with it.
Jennifer, Patrick's daughter, dials 911. It's not the only emergency call placed that night.
In the meantime, 25 minutes later, Virginia also places a 911 call. Is it that Virginia was using this time to come up with her sinister plan? What's the explanation? How is she going to explain what took place? And in that short amount of time, she's able to put together, initially, a pretty good story.
Forensic Officer Ryan Howard is amongst the first on the scene.
When I first got there, the victim was still on the floor. There had been an attempted medical intervention.
It's too late. Patrick is dead. He's right there in the entryway, lying dead on the floor.
He received 5 gunshots in total. 2 entered his back and exited out his chest. Both of those perforated his lungs, which would cause substantial distress relatively quickly. There would be a lot of internal bleeding. His chest cavity as well as his lungs would start to fill with blood. He had an entrance wound at the back of the right tricep that exited out the right bicep. That just passed through muscle and bone. He had another graze injury to the back of his neck. That didn't go into him. It just basically struck the surface of his skin and then continued on. And lastly, he had another graze wound in the webbing of his right hand.
Virginia is still at the scene. She had been unaware that Patrick's daughter had called the police.
The suspect in this case, Miss Vertetis, she was unaware that 911 had been notified and that the police were already responding. And she had waited, I believe it was approximately 20 minutes or maybe even a little bit more, before she picked up the phone to dial 911 herself to give her account or to report this. As she was dialing the phone or maybe had just connected, the local police came through the door. So her timing was off immediately on her story.
Virginia tries to lay out essentially a self-defense claim. She tries to use spousal abuse syndrome, that she was in such a toxic relationship, such an abusive relationship, that as a result, this was her only choice, that it was either kill or be killed.
One of the first things that officers come across was the murder weapon, discarded at the bottom of the stairs.
The murder weapon was a 6-shot revolver, a .38 caliber firearm, so it's capable of firing 6 shots.
I think the pistol had been recovered by the responding officers laying on either the first or second step. She had laid the gun there.
Virginia claims that Patrick himself gave his most prized possession, his service revolver, because he was fearful that Virginia needed some self-protection. and that he was, quote, temporarily loaning it to her. It was on loan to her. Now, we're talking about a guy who is sometimes a paid bodyguard, somebody who certainly had enough access to weapons and money for weapons. Why would he choose his most prized possession, his service weapon, and give that to Virginia? It makes no sense.
And there was more to raise their suspicions.
She, remember, has said, he's been beating me. He was beating me. He was attacking me. He was coming after me. He was hitting me. He was going to grab the gun. How could that be when Patrick has been making phone calls? He's called his daughter 3 times in that few minutes that this attack was going on. 3 times. How could he be on the phone with his daughter, protecting himself, and still be beating her? How could that be?
In this case, the defense tried to assert the fact that he was coming up at her. And one of their big issues was the break in the window of the storm door, claiming that the victim was the aggressor and forcibly entered the house and was coming towards her up the stairs.
Remember when she tells police that Patrick was so angry when he runs in the door, he slams the door and the glass shatters in the door? Well, sure enough, the glass in the door is shattered, but it's shattered with a bullet.
To cops first at the apartment, it appeared that Virginia was lying. Police were also puzzled by where they found Patrick's phone.
When we got there, his phone was in his pocket. It was actually a flip phone, and it had been closed up and was back in his pocket, which we knew that could not have happened.
Virginia's story simply didn't add up. Why had she waited so long, 25 minutes, before calling 911?
I think it was pretty clear she probably had a moment of, I don't want to say clarity, but maybe clarity to the point where she realized she had just killed him, and she needed to start putting things in order for some sort of story to tell the police. In other words, he's here, he's dead, he's not going anywhere. I'm sure not going to move him. I'm going to have to come up with something here. And she started to fabricate her story right from the beginning.
From the start, nobody disputed that Virginia had pulled the trigger.
Seeing the victim's body and the fact that there were frenzied shots in his upper body shows that there was an emotionality behind this killing, that there was more of a crime of passion rather than necessarily a crime that was premeditated. And I think it points to the fact that she really just lost control of her emotions.
She was charged with murder. The key question facing detectives and soon a jury would be, did she have every right to defend herself? Detectives began to piece together the evidence needed to decide if she was an abused victim or a woman made for murder.
One of the first things we look for in a shooting scene are any identifiable marks from projectiles impacting things other than maybe the victim. And they were located within the stairwell, the confines of the stairwell from the first to second floor, as well as in the walls in the foyer on the first floor, the front hallway.
What happens is you marry up the bloodstain evidence at the scene, the physical evidence in the way of the bullets and the bullet strikes and the impact, and the wounding that occurred to Mr. Gilhooly, and you form a reconstruction, essentially, of the events that transpired during the actual shooting event, more or less from start to finish.
It was that reconstruction which would form the basis of the prosecution in court. It was a job they took very seriously.
I'm not working against that woman. I'm not working against that defense attorney. I'm working for the dead. I work for the dead. He's gone. Somebody has to speak for him. We are the medical examiners, the crime scene investigators, the detectives. We're the people that have to speak for the dead. And we got to take whatever they're telling us, put it in a nice package, and tell it to the jury.
So who to believe? The volatile woman with a need to be loved, or the heavy-drinking ex-cop with an eye for the ladies? Had he beaten her and she shot in self-defense, or was she a straight-up killer? In March 2016, charged with murder, Virginia Vatesis faced a courtroom and stuck to her story of self-defense when killing Patrick Gilhooly.
The defense tells the jury this was a clear case of domestic abuse. This was kill or be killed. Either she took him out or he was going to take her out. That was her choice, and she made it. It was self-defense. The prosecution says, oh no, we can show you why that isn't true.
Prosecutors offered forensic examinations and detailed ballistic reports and provided a picture of the critical timeline.
So in the seconds leading up to the actual shooting, they both would have likely been in an area of the bedroom, which was at the top of the stairway. There's a small landing. As Mr. Gilhooly would have left the bedroom, or at least been in that hallway portion at the top of the small landing.
And what does Virginia do with that? She runs back to her bedroom, and from underneath the mattress, she pulls out the one thing that Patrick would have cherished, and that's his own service revolver.
After she retrieved the firearm, Mr. Gilhooly attempted to leave the residence by going down a flight of stairs. As he makes his way around a small railing at the top of the stairway to head down the steps, it would have given Ms. Vatesis the opportunity to also be in that same area, an elevated area.
One shot, two shot. She unloads the gun onto Patrick, who tactically, like any officer would know, is at total disadvantage.
She fired at him 6 times while he wasn't even looking at her. And that was one of the things we had to deal with, was them saying, no, he's coming at her. No, he's not. And we were able to prove, it was important that we had to prove that he was facing away. He was unsuspecting of the gunfire until it started. From that point, he was defenseless. He was wounded, and he ended up on the floor dead. And she fired until there was no more bullets in that weapon to fire. She fired every round she had.
Evidence, said prosecutors, of murder, not self-defense.
He's shot in the back. He's moving down the stairwell, or at least he's facing away from her when he is shot multiple times in the back. Because he can't move laterally, her target is confined. It's almost trapped in the stairwell. It's in a fatal funnel, as we call it. There's nowhere for him to go.
To saying that she never fired a weapon in her life, and to get 4 out of 6 bullseyes in the back, it's pretty good for somebody that never shot a weapon before.
Bit by bit, specialists disproved Virginia's version of events.
My role in this particular case was to show that, in fact, the bullet was the first impact to that storm door. We swung that door multiple times, as hard as we physically could, and it did not break. It just did not. It waffled, it vibrated like it's supposed to do, but it did not break. I teach shooting reconstruction all around the country. In the process of doing that, I've literally shot through hundreds and hundreds of panes of tempered glass. Each and every time, that tempered glass behaves exactly as it's designed to upon the impact of a bullet, producing those unique fractures that identify that bullet as being the first and only impact to have struck that glass initially.
And Patrick's blood transference solved the mystery of his phone.
She put the phone in his pocket, and somehow she got his blood on her during that contact transfer of the blood. And some of it ended up on her clothes as well.
Most powerful of all were the calls that Patrick had made to his daughter Jennifer and his final words.
And he says, "Holy blank! She's got a gun and she's gonna..." Shot, shot, shot.
Patrick Gilhooly, a former NYPD detective, a famed bodyguard to the stars, put a lot of bad guys and bad girls away during his career in law enforcement. And it would be his own words, his last phone call, that helps solve his own murder.
The prosecution was in no doubt that Virginia Vatesis had killed Patrick Gilhooly in cold blood.
I believe it was a murder. a flat-out murder. I believe she intended to shoot the gun. It's not an area where she let one round go. She fired the weapon completely empty, and she fired at her target, and she hit it 5 out of 6 times. So this was an intentional shooting, which resulted in his murder.
The jury thought the same. Virginia Vitetis was found guilty of the murder of Patrick Gilhooly and sentenced to 30 years in prison.
Virginia's convicted of first-degree murder. She could have gotten up to 50 years in prison. Instead, she gets 30 years. That's the minimum sentence under the charge of first-degree murder. The judge, when he's announcing the sentence, says that he's considering her age. She's 55 years old at the time.
Patrick's family were unhappy with the sentence.
Patrick's ex-wife stands up and reads a letter from Patrick's own daughters. And in the letter, they talk about how much they love their father, how much they're going to miss their father, how much they wish they could have their father walk them down the aisle when they're getting married, how much this woman took from them.
I think Virginia knew that the most powerful tool she had in her arsenal was her sexuality, and I'm sure that's why she was becoming increasingly insecure, because she was getting older and there was constantly a new group of women who were younger and maybe what she perceived as more attractive than she was.
Patrick had been killed by a woman who had a long history of abandonment issues and who identified as sexually attractive.
And when it looks like he has made the decision and he's going to leave her, she decides she can't let it happen and she does something about it.
Once that buzzer, that red flag went up in her mind that, wow, they're really leaving me, then whatever governor she had that made sense flew off her, and there was no rules after that.
From childhood to adulthood, the men in her life had abandoned her. That's the way she felt, a woman truly scorned.
So really, at the end of the day, when I heard all the information and after the trial, I realized that, in my opinion, those 5 bullets were for those 5 alpha males in her life that rejected her and abandoned her. Her father, her first husband, her second husband, her third husband, myself, and Patrick. And each one of those bullets were emotional and intentional.
Virginia Vitetis appealed her murder conviction, saying that the jury had been misdirected about her right to self-defense. A new trial was ordered, but Vitetis accepted a lesser charge of aggravated manslaughter and a reduced sentence of 20 years. She can look forward to potentially being freed by 2034, when she will be 72 years old. Was she made for murder? And if so, was fear of rejection by men the reason that she pulled the trigger 4 times to leave Patrick Gilhooly dead?
Maybe thought that she was losing the biggest tool she had in her tool belt to get men's attention. And instead of thinking about other ways to derive self-esteem, like working on her skills or trying to feel better about herself more internally, she just grasped even more at the straws of her sexual adventures and hoping that men would still be interested in that. But I'm sure that there was a lot of feelings about possibly being replaced by other women all the time.
Denise had plans to celebrate their wedding anniversary, a romantic break, just the two of them.
Mike never returns home.
Mike had gone hunting that morning, and then nobody heard from him.
There was a rumor that the guy probably got snatched up by our larger alligators until he decomposed.
For almost 2 decades, investigators are baffled by the disappearance of Mike Williams. Was he the victim of a terrible accident, or had he fallen foul of someone made for murder?
This is somebody who was able to fool everybody in her community, and I don't think anybody suspected her except for possibly Mike's mother.
Probing the mind and the timeline of killers, this series reveals the red flags of those who will one day be investigated for taking a life. To the outside world, Denise Williams is a lucky woman. Her husband Mike worked harder than most to achieve a lifestyle for his child that he himself had not enjoyed.
Mike had come from a modest background. His parents, his daddy was a Greyhound bus driver. His mom was a daycare provider. And they lived in a double-wide trailer.
Mike met Denise Merrill while they were both at school. Both were sporty, popular. He played football, she was a cheerleader. Quickly, they become high school sweethearts. It was through Denise that Mike met Brian Winchester. Denise and Brian had been friends since preschool. Mike became a close friend of Brian, whose girlfriend and future wife Kathy, also a cheerleader, formed the final part of a perfect foursome.
Denise Williams and Brian Winchester went to high school. They went to North Florida Christian. And it was at North Florida Christian that they met Mike Williams, and they met the woman who would later become Brian Winchester's wife. And by all accounts, the four of them were inseparable. They were fast friends. They all stayed in Tallahassee after graduating from high school.
In 1994, Brian and Kathy married and started a family. Mike and Denise married the same year and had a daughter 5 years later.
Denise and Mike had a very strong marriage. They had a beautiful daughter. They'd actually even been featured, I think, on a local news show when she was born. Mike adored Denise, did everything for her. Really, I mean, he was a great husband, and she had her own life. She was an accountant. She was getting ready to go back to work, but she was going to be a stay-at-home mom for a while. From all accounts and everything that I've seen or heard, they had a very happy marriage. They lived in a nice home and had family support and friends nearby, and didn't no signs of trouble.
Except some did see signs of trouble.
Denise was happily married to Mike, or so it seemed, but it appeared that she was carrying on a years-long affair with her high school sweetheart, Brian, who was also married. And Brian's wife, Kathy, actually said that they'd often double-dated, but even during that time, she had highly suspected that they were having an affair behind their back.
Mike was oblivious to anything Denise was or was not doing. He was too busy working. He'd often be found in the office before dawn. On one occasion, his boss took the office keys away so that Mike couldn't come into work at the weekend. Denise certainly didn't seem to mind that Mike spent so much time working away from home. Even his hobbies took him away from the family.
When he was 15, he started duck hunting, and it became his favorite hobby for the rest of his life.
On Mike and Denise's 6th wedding anniversary, the couple planned to go away for the night to celebrate. There was even talk of taking the opportunity to begin trying for a second child, something that Mike desperately wanted. But first, he had time to get in a few hours of hunting.
He was going to go to the Florida-Georgia line to Lake Seminole. And in Lake Seminole, it's a huge area. But you see, Mike was an avid duck hunter. He had his spot. He knew the areas he wanted to go.
He is supposed to have came over here duck hunting that morning and by himself. Nobody else was supposed to have been with him.
So before dawn, he packed up his truck and he left for Lake Seminole, which is about an hour away from Tallahassee. It's on the Georgia state line. And this was something he just really loved doing. He told his wife, "I'll be back in a few hours."
Denise stayed at home, apparently preparing for their romantic break in the nearby fishing town of Apalachicola. But when hours passed with no sign of Mike, she sounded the alarm.
Mike Williams was last seen on Saturday morning, December 16th, 2000. As best we can tell, he entered his security code at his place of employment to retrieve a gun, we believe. And he went out to Lake Seminole and he never came back.
When he didn't show up for around noontime, his wife started calling around looking for him, and she finally got a hold of somebody that had been fishing with him before. That guy got with her father, and they come over here and notified local law enforcement, and that's when the search began.
A friend who responded to Denise's panic-stricken phone call that day was Mike's high school buddy and duck hunting partner, Brian Winchester. He and his father, Marcus, told Denise that everything would be fine. Then they headed to the lake.
By the time Marcus Winchester and Brian Winchester got out to Lake Seminole, the weather had gotten bad. There were some local law enforcement who responded, and then they contacted the Florida Wildlife Commission, the FWC, which oversees game and wildlife, and they began a search for what they treated as a missing person.
Perhaps he got lost. Perhaps he has gotten bogged down into the shallow but mucky waters. Mike would have gone with the proper gear. In order to go duck hunting, he would have had to worn waders and rubber boots. And if one was to be in shallow water, they could easily sink, and the waders themselves would pull somebody down below the water's surface. And that was the big concern.
Despite their desperate efforts, the searchers couldn't find Mike, but they did find plenty of evidence that he'd been there.
Friends see Mike's truck near a remote boat launch on the Florida side. Meanwhile, a helicopter pilot spots the boat floating, and then law enforcement finds his shotgun in the boat. So they're assuming something happened to him. Maybe he drowned.
Mike was last seen in what is known as Stump Lake. Body of water at the deepest area is 8 feet, sometimes 6 feet, and other times very shallow. It's called Stump Lake because there were a lot of trees that grew out of this lake. There were a lot of rotted trees that had fallen, and the only thing left were the stumps, but they would be either hidden just below the water's surface or sticking up just above. So there weren't a lot of motorboats on this kind of lake. This wasn't a pleasure lake. This was a fisherman's lake.
For days, the search continues. What can have happened to family man and seasoned hunter Mike Williams?
I would submit that everyone who was involved in the search for Mike Williams, with the exception of maybe one or two very, very optimistic, very, very hopeful people, believed that probably after 4 or 5 days that there was not going to be a likely recovery.
At first, family, friends and investigators believed that Mike must have drowned, but a week after his disappearance, they started to question that theory.
There were a number of different ways in which they could explain the body not being able to be found. If he had been drowned, possibly the body would be floating, but it's also possible that maybe the alligators would have dismembered his body and then they wouldn't be able to find his remains in one piece.
If he had drowned, where's his body? Because normally in this area it would have floated up. And that hasn't happened, and days go by. Since there's no body, you have to wonder, well, what could have happened? And you start ticking off the questions.
It was a mystery. 10 days into the search, investigators made another disturbing discovery. Mike's khaki camouflage hunting hat floating on top of the lake's dark waters.
This was important because it led the searchers to believe that they didn't think Mike drowned, because the hat wasn't located in particularly deep waters or just floating in a huge body of water. This would be an area that they should have found a body along with that hat. The body should have risen to the top. It wasn't a deep body of water. It was shallow.
Baffled by the absence of a body, investigators began to consider a sensational new theory.
All I remember was it was a hunter who went missing, and sometime in early 2001, the rumors or the newspaper had started suggesting that it might have been alligators or something like that.
Seminole Lake has some of the biggest alligators in the state. They grow to between 13, 14 feet at max. There's some very old ones there, and they can get up to 1,000 pounds.
Within a few weeks, the search for Mike's body was scaled back. Soon, no one was looking for him anymore. Eaten by an alligator or not, by now recovery seemed increasingly unlikely. Something struck locals as strange, though. By February 2001, 2 months after her husband went missing, wife Denise was doing all she could to avoid attention.
Denise has really kept a low profile during the search. This has been covered by news media, but Denise isn't talking to anybody. She's the grieving widow. When the search gets called off, she accepts the fact that Mike has drowned, that Mike somehow has died. And so she calls for a memorial service to honor her now deceased husband.
Denise seems quick to accept that her husband is gone. Is this the action of a desperate widow? Forensic psychologist Judy Ho believes that Denise was demonstrating that she was not quite what she claimed to be.
Denise is somebody who can definitely fly under the radar. It appears that she can appeal to human emotions quite realistically, so that people wouldn't think that she was just putting on those emotions.
A breakthrough came in June that year when a fisherman from nearby Jackson County discovered Mike's waders in the water. They were in pristine condition.
There were no teeth marks on the victim's clothing, but an alligator or any crocodilian doesn't have to leave a tooth mark somewhere in order to kill a person. They actually have a very sensitive bite force when they want to. They pick up their hatchlings, they pick up things gently. They grab something very gently in some cases and sink it and drown it and can leave not even a mark on the person. Yeah, it's very possible.
Believing that the floating waders would at long last lead them to Mike's submerged body, police divers were brought in. It was a tense moment for the community in North Florida, who waited weeks for news, with wife Denise more devastated than anybody. This was simply not supposed to happen.
Denise even said, he told me that he would be back in a few hours. It was our anniversary. We had planned to celebrate.
Was that Denise's plan? Or did she have other intentions? Because she and a new man in her bed would soon make an application to officially record Mike as dead.
They were very patient. They waited 5 years after Mike's death to get married because they didn't want to arouse suspicion and also to allow the life insurance to accrue more funds. The reason why I believe that the courts granted Denise her request to declare Mike legally dead was because they had made it seem like they were not persons of interest.
Specialist search and recovery divers hoped that they might find the body of Mike Williams entangled in the dense hydrilla weeds that choked the lake bed. They had uncovered Mike's camouflage jacket, hunting license, and a flashlight. Could they finally find closure for his apparently devastated family? But 2 weeks after they began their work, there was still no sign of a body.
The mere fact that they found those items, it should have generated a murder investigation, where more work should have been done.
Mike's mother, Cheryl, was not prepared to give up on what happened to her son, even as those around her, including wife Denise, suggested he was almost certainly dead.
Mike's mother, she's not accepting this. She's not ready to believe that her son is dead. There are too many questions, too many suspicious things. This just doesn't make sense. She's not letting go. She's not giving up on her son.
Cheryl paid for billboard appeals, handed out flyers, and took out adverts asking the public for help. She did everything in her power to keep the search going, even when her daughter-in-law came under suspicion.
Ever since Cheryl Williams began essentially what I'd call her crusade, Denise Williams has been vilified by certain parts of the Tallahassee community.
The grapevine in Tallahassee was alive with whispers. Was Denise Williams really the grieving widow? Gossip was perhaps the least of her worries. With Mike gone, Denise needed to become the family breadwinner.
And at this time in early 2001, Denise was still a stay-at-home mom. She had an infant daughter. She had no ready source of income, so she needed to do things to take care of the bills that were starting to mount up in terms of her home, vehicle, insurance, other things.
Luckily for Denise, she knew just how to get her hands on a very large sum of money.
She has filed a petition to have Mike declared legally dead. A county judge grants it. And this allows her to move forward with getting the money from that life insurance policy. And Denise collects more than $1.5 million.
Denise's friends began to notice that her behaviour wasn't quite that of the grieving widow. Were her priorities in the right place? She had filed a claim for life insurance less than 3 weeks after Mike had disappeared. Even police at that stage had no idea what had happened to him. And the cause of death that she listed on the paperwork, accidental drowning. Amongst those helping her, one of her oldest friends, Brian Winchester.
The sad reality about life insurance is you don't want to ever need it, but when you need it, you actually have to ask for it. And there's no set time that somebody's supposed to sit around and wait before they actually begin the process. And so it was at the direction of Denise's father and with the input of Brian and Marcus that they began the process of simply filing a claim.
For someone to file for insurance when you haven't even recovered a body within 19 days would seem suspicious to me.
From an outside view, it may seem suspicious, but one of the things that everyone needs to remember is that the person who was in charge of handling their insurance affairs for both Mike and Denise was the Winchester Group, and that was the insurance company that was run by Marcus Winchester, who was Brian Winchester's father.
Not a man who would benefit from any payout.
She was convincing to the public about her being a grieving widow, and the manner of death in which Mike had passed away didn't seem to arouse any additional suspicion at the time.
Despite this, forensic psychologist Judy Ho believes there were signs that something bad had happened to Mike and that his mother, Cheryl, had noticed.
Mike's mother, Cheryl, never gave up because she never thought that this seemed to make sense, that Mike would just disappear. And maybe because Cheryl knew Mike and Denise very well, perhaps there was some suspicion that something wasn't quite right. And so Cheryl really led the charge to essentially overturn Mike's initial decision on the case and to actually have him declared a suspicious missing person rather than this is just, kind of a run-of-the-mill horrible accident.
Cheryl Williams continued with her campaign for an investigation into Mike's disappearance.
It's the persistence of a mother, because things aren't adding up to the mom. Mike never hunted alone. His clothing is not ripped, not torn, not tattered. The gas tank in the boat is completely full. The location where the boat is. By this time, Mike's own mother has done her own research about wind speed and currents at the time that Mike went missing. None of this added up to her. She wasn't buying it.
The Florida Department of Law Enforcement reopens the investigation into Mike's disappearance because now they have enough evidence to say this doesn't make sense. They look back and they say, hold on, none of it adds up. No body floating up. Something's wrong here. So Cheryl has finally been heard.
The inconsistencies were starting to add up. Was this really a tragic accident?
If someone had fallen off a boat and they drowned, a lot of other things are going to eat them long before an alligator ever touches them. This part of the United States, they're going to have crawdads on them. They're going to have turtles eating them. A lot of other things are going to be cleaning that up before an alligator even thinks about it. That's not their food supply. It's not what they're looking for.
There was more to trouble those skeptical about Mike's disappearance.
Alligators, in essence, almost hibernate in the wintertime. The temperatures were cool, in the 50s, very damp. When the temperatures are in that kind of setting, alligators are not feeding. This was not feeding season for alligators.
Their feeding slows down. Again, they want to be at 88.5 degrees optimally to be able to feed and digest their food. When they're not at that temperature, everything kind of changes. They will slow down their feeding. If they do eat something, it takes them longer to digest it, move it on. And really, gators only have to eat once a year. If they can find a good meal that feed them that one time in a year, and they're good to go.
Time passes. A lot of it. Time enough for Denise to get married again to her insurance salesman and lifelong friend, Brian Winchester.
5 years have passed now, We still don't know where Mike is, how he died, did he die? He's been declared officially dead. And Denise and Brian get married. And they move in together into the same home that Mike and Denise had shared in Tallahassee.
The gossip mills in Tallahassee went into overdrive.
The idea that Brian Winchester and Denise Williams had an affair is essentially that urban legend that develops from the fact that, yes, Denise Williams did marry Brian Winchester many, many years after Mike's disappearance. People presume that because they got married, they must have had a relationship prior to Mike's disappearance, and that's simply not true.
In 2007, the investigation into Mike Williams' disappearance, prompted by his mother, ground to a halt.
You're working up an investigation with no body, and that can be very difficult because the body itself can tell a story. It's a body of evidence. And this was the challenge for law enforcement. And as a result, you don't get as many resources thrown in on a missing person case. There's no crime scene documentary. There's no preservation of evidence. There's no preserving the items that were recovered. And so, in essence, the case goes cold. It goes dormant.
Later that year, new evidence appears. Mike's brother Nick contacted police. He wanted to report a missing gun, a .22 caliber Ruger pistol that Mike had inherited from their father.
By 2007, Denise has returned all of Mike's original weapons, all of his guns and whatever he had hunting-wise, to his family. But they're missing a weapon, a .22. And through the help of the local sheriff and a court order, they're able to obtain that gun back from Denise.
Why had she kept the gun? One that she had actually claimed on insurance, reporting it as lost. Once again, detectives find themselves wondering.
Mike has been declared dead, but now he's a suspicious missing person. So that causes the state of Florida to look at this case as perhaps this is insurance fraud. Maybe Mike and Denise are working together. Or what is the conspiracy here?
So it's reopened, but nothing really happens. And then eventually it gets closed again.
7 years after Mike Williams vanished, it seemed all hope of solving the case had been abandoned. But again, Cheryl wasn't about to take no for an answer in her quest for the truth.
Well, this lady went herself, made flyers, put them on light poles in Tallahassee. She had a picket sign that she stood out in front of the church that the Winchester, Brian, and Denise attended. She got funding. She had big billboards. You seen my son. She took out ads in the paper. I mean, she never stopped. She wrote about 9,000 letters to the governor of the state. She kept it public. She never let it die.
200 letters were written by Mike's mom. Not one of them was opened. Not one of them. They were just tossed aside. It's a closed case. Not my job.
For 7 years, Cheryl had fought to prove that her son had been the victim of a carefully planned murder.
And I'm sure this entire time, Denise was quite concerned because she had thought that she had planned for everything. She had been patient, and she had thought that maybe this was just going to be behind her. And clearly, Cheryl was not going to let her live that down.
Finally, Cheryl found someone who'd listen, and when she did, everything began to unravel.
The authorities release a 3-page indictment, and it spells out what they believe happened.
It's something out of a bad Saturday evening movie.
A movie involving a woman who was made for murder, perhaps. In 2008, Derek Wester, a detective in the Jackson County Sheriff Department, had become deeply troubled by some of the claims being made by Cheryl, Mike Williams' mother. There were simply too many unanswered questions for his liking.
The things that she brought up kind of just made you like want to look into it more. Want to just track down this to appease this grieving mother, and then it just kind of just snowballed into maybe there really was something happened here.
Wester delved deep into Mike's life insurance arrangements. He'd had 3 policies, including one taken out just months before he went missing. The payouts were now bankrolling Denise and Brian's lifestyle.
And I was having a discussion with some other investigators about whether or not he actually had applied for the insurance policy that the Winchester Financial Group had wrote for him, and Brian Winchester was the agent. But I had needed Mike Williams' picture for something, so I had his stuff laid on my desk, and I pulled up the application for his insurance, his life insurance. And I pulled up the driver's license number, typed in the computer, was going to get his driver's license picture. And when I typed the number in, it popped up Denise Williams' picture. So I was like, well, how is this? I mean, she's not the applicant. Why is her driver's license number on there?
Investigator Wester now suspects that Mike's policy was altered in the days following his disappearance.
Did Brian Winchester go and do that? Yeah, I would speculate. He said, well, man, we just need a number. And so she pulled hers out, and they copied the number down.
And Wester found more.
He had a different policy in between the time he went missing and the time she filed for a presumptive death certificate. Because we had a check that she had wrote and signed to pay the premium during that 6-month period.
Wester also looked at Denise and Brian's relationship. Had it really begun after Mike's death? What he found painted a complicated picture, one which Denise's attorney does not believe proves any prior relationship between Denise and Brian Winchester.
There was no evidence of that. There was no evidence that suggested that Denise Williams and Brian Winchester were having an affair. They were in close proximity to each other. All of them were. Kathy Thomas and Mike Williams and Brian Winchester and Denise Williams would go out socially.
But police records told a different story.
One night, the Tallahassee Police Department had called in a abandoned vehicle at a church down the road from Denise and Mike Williams' house. They were still married at the time. Mike was at some conference, and the truck was registered to Brian Winchester. Well, when they looked up the contact number for the owners, they called Brian Winchester's house, and again, Kathy Thomas, or Kathy Winchester at that time, answered the phone. Well, she thought that her husband was duck hunting in Arkansas or somewhere out of town. So she called Brian's father, and by the time the father got over there, the vehicle had already been gone. So that was just, what was his vehicle doing there?
Denise and Brian had gone through a lot to be together, more than anyone could possibly have imagined.
I think that it did take an enormous toll on both Brian and Denise, because they were looking forward to this quiet, blissful, happy life. And they thought that if they would just be patient enough, they would be able to get that. And I think that their life is not very peaceful, because they're constantly thinking if the next phone call is going to be from the authorities saying, we have a warrant for your arrest, or we want to bring you in for questioning. And I think that they knew that they weren't completely in the clear.
After a years-long affair and 7 years of patiently waiting for the right time to be together, could the relationship possibly live up to the hype?
It's not impossible to consider that it could have caused more fights and arguments about how airtight their story was, if somebody had left a clue inadvertently somewhere. Perhaps one or both of them thought that this relationship was going to be doomed anyway. Certainly Brian and Denise both have a history of cheating, and it sounds like Brian became even more involved in that, and Denise wasn't going to put up with it. But you could also think about this a little bit as a self-sabotaging action on the part of Brian. I think he realized that maybe the relationship really was coming to an end, and he was essentially speeding it along by acting recklessly because he knew that Denise would not put up with it.
7 years after they married, the relationship began to crumble.
By 2012, this happy couple, Denise and Brian, not so happy anymore. Apparently, Brian has a little sex addiction problem. And that's enough for Denise to say, I'm out of here. So Denise decides she's getting out of the marriage, and she and Brian separate.
And so he's no longer with Denise, but he still loves her very much. That's the love of his life, or at least in his mind. By 2016, the marriage is going to end. They were separated, some periods of getting back together, but Denise has had enough. She has now filed for divorce.
For 4 years, the couple's relationship had been on and off. Brian had sought therapy for his addiction, but struggled to fight his demons. With a divorce looming, he made one last desperate play for Denise.
I think Brian was becoming increasingly desperate. I think he realized once him and Denise had separated that he actually really loved Denise and he wanted to save the relationship, but Denise had already made up her mind. I think he was becoming more and more erratic because she wasn't giving him the time of day. So it led to this very essentially violent and desperate altercation where Denise actually thought that maybe her own life was in jeopardy.
In August of 2016, something kind of bizarre happens. Denise is driving on her way to her job at Florida State University when all of a sudden, Brian springs from the back seat and basically attacks her.
And when Denise gets in her car, it's something out of a bad Saturday evening movie. He pops up from behind the seat.
And he snatches her cell phone away from her, and he starts shouting demands at her.
And he holds a weapon to her. And he's pleading for her to keep their marriage together. And he kidnaps her.
And when they did eventually apprehend him for that, he had a tarp and he had bottles of bleach and he had other items in his truck that suggested that he was probably going to kill and bury Denise Williams.
Brian is charged with kidnapping, domestic assault, and burglary.
Brian and Denise's potential divorce was a game changer.
There's a law that says spouses cannot be compelled to testify, but these guys are getting divorced. Now there's a criminal case against Brian. Someone's going to sing. This may finally be good news for Cheryl and her son.
This premise of husband and wife privilege was very beneficial to Denise initially. She knew that Brian would never say anything against her and vice versa because they were in on it. They were co-conspirators in this death. They were in on it. And so by both of their actions, their silence was sealed.
When the marriage ended, so did that pact of silence. A secret deal was struck between husband number 2, Brian Winchester, and the prosecutors who had charged him in relation to holding Denise at gunpoint in her car. A deal which meant the unearthing of Mike Williams' body.
I think that Brian got to a point where he realized there was that point of no return. He believed that Denise had already betrayed him by turning him over to the authorities. And he also believed that Denise didn't love him anymore. And I think he wanted to hurt Denise. And also he was really just thinking about himself because he knew that there was going to be no future with her. And that's what caused him to exchange information about exactly what had happened to Mike, implicating Denise in the process, essentially stating that she was really the mastermind behind all of it.
Brian Winchester had handed information to detectives in return for a lenient sentence for abducting his estranged wife.
Florida law enforcement officials hold a news conference.
Good afternoon. I'm Special Agent in Charge Mark Perez with the Tallahassee Regional Operations Center.
The reporters are all there with their cameras set up, and they announce, after all of these years, 17 years, Mike Williams' body has been found.
That search led to the recovery of human remains, and FDLE's crime laboratory analysts confirmed through DNA analysis that the human remains are those of Mike Williams.
Brian Winchester got the deal of the century. Brian Winchester was facing life in prison for kidnapping Denise Williams at gunpoint. He was 2 to 3 months away from going to a trial. Brian Winchester had been in jail for almost a year, a little over a year. And when faced with the prospect of having to go to trial, looking at life in prison, he approaches the state attorney's office and offers to tell them a story.
17 years after her husband Mike vanished without a trace, Denise Williams would be formally charged with murdering her husband. What emerged was a complex web of lies designed to entrap Mike Williams, to lure him to his death, and to get away with his murder.
Brian is the star witness, and he says, yes, I pulled the trigger, but Denise was the mastermind.
A mastermind who not only planned her high school sweetheart's death right down to the last detail, but she also dragged in her lover and her best friend since elementary school.
I think that probably required a large amount of preparation on Denise's part, but also at the same time shows her callousness, that anything that she expressed in terms of sadness or grief was really put on because she was one who orchestrated these events.
Denise Williams convinced the police, the press and the town of Tallahassee into believing she was a grieving widow, rebuilding her life after the tragic and mysterious disappearance of her husband. But in reality, it appeared she had made a plan for murder, which she thought she could get away with.
She was clearly not emotionally attached to her husband at all to be able to carry it through and be able to even play this part in front of so many people and be able to be quite convincing for a period of time.
In May of 2018, Denise Williams is leaving her job at Florida State University. She's on her way to go find her daughter and celebrate her birthday when police show up and handcuff her and take her into custody. Denise is under arrest for the murder of her husband, Mike Williams.
Everybody who's in jail facing a murder charge is very concerned and very upset. I think it's more troubling and more upsetting if you're innocent, because you're wondering, how did I get here? Why am I here? Why am I in jail for murder and the person who confessed to it isn't?
The public gallery was packed.
The courtroom was kind of like a little circus. I mean, essentially, everybody in town had thought Denise Williams was guilty for years and years and years.
Some had come to see Denise face justice, others to find out what had driven her. A woman so outwardly happy. Why would she commit such a heinous crime? Was Denise driven by her relationship with Brian, or was she simply a woman without conscience, one made for murder? The key to finding the truth was the man she had trusted, Brian Winchester.
And at that point, I think he not only wanted to hurt Denise, but also because he was just trying so desperately to try to save himself, knowing that him and Denise didn't have a future. And I don't think there was any question that this would spiral to this point, because Denise essentially betrayed him first by turning him into the authorities at a moment when he was desperately pleading for her to take him back.
While Denise faced a life term for conspiracy to murder, Brian had his deal. He was going to jail for kidnapping, but there was no mention of him being charged with killing his friend.
He knows where the body's buried because he killed Mike Williams. And by offering the body and by then adding a little extra, which is, you can go after Denise Williams, I'll make up a story for you.
For homicide detective Brian Harris, the facts speak for themselves.
There is no chance Denise is not involved in this murder. It is so well premeditated, well thought out.
Denise gave nothing away as she sat in the Leon County Courthouse.
I believe that Denise probably got a little arrogant and maybe even a little cocky because they had gotten away with this for so long.
She was very, 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 cold, very not responsive, kind of almost robotic.
She maintained her innocence. Her lawyer told the court Denise had always believed that Mike had died in a tragic accident.
The cops know all the details. They know all the information. They know where the bones were buried. They know the details and the motive and the why this has happened. Somebody talked. This was a plan laying in wait, and 17 years later, it all came unraveled.
So Brian says he and Denise start having an affair. And that affair started 3 years before Mike disappeared. 3 years before he was killed.
For 3 years they met in secret, in vehicles and hotel rooms. On double dates they would secretly kiss as soon as Mike and Kathy's backs were turned. What Brian thought was a love match was actually Denise finding the perfect person to help her out of her marriage and into the lifestyle that she wanted.
Perhaps she thought that she was really the power behind the coupling and that she had him where she wanted him and that he would never betray her, because by betraying her, he would be betraying himself and implicating himself. I don't think that she ever imagined that he would get to a point where, in an act of some level of self-perseverance, that he would turn her over, hoping that it would mean he would get a lesser sentence.
Brian Winchester tells jurors that Denise was the mastermind. For nearly a year, Mike had no idea he was living with a woman who wanted him dead.
She wanted Brian to kill his wife and help her kill Mike, her husband. But an ironic twist, if you can say Brian has principles, Brian told Denise, I can't do that. to the mother of my children.
On the morning of the 16th of December 2000, Mike Williams had not gone to the lake alone.
As best we can gather, and from what Brian Winchester testified to, he had made arrangements with Mike Williams on the evening of December 15th, 2000, to go hunting with Mike out at Lake Seminole. No one knew that Brian Winchester and Mike Williams were going to be hunting together.
This is where Brian and Mike launched their boat the morning that Mike Williams was murdered.
According to Brian Winchester, who's really the only person who knows what happened, he and Mike got in a small boat. He pushed off from a landing.
They had launched the boat. It was a little 15-foot canoe with a Go Devil motor on the back. He was driving the boat, and Mike Williams was in the front of it.
They weren't on the water very long before Brian Winchester adjusted the boat in such a way that Mike Williams fell overboard.
They were dressed in duck hunting gear, which included a set of waders, and it was Brian Winchester's thought and anticipation that he would fall into the water, and the waders would fill up with water, and he would go to the bottom and drown.
But it did not go according to plan. For a start, a safety-conscious Mike had practiced many times removing his waders in the water. He managed to keep his head above the surface.
It's not called Stump Field or Stump Lake for nothing. When he was tossed out of the boat, Mike was able to grab onto a stump.
So he was able to tread water, so to speak, stay above water, and he began hollering, yelling for help. And Brian Winchester freaked out, didn't know what else to do.
Brian Winchester circled around him approximately 3 times, and then while looking directly at Mike Williams, he shot him in the face with a 12-gauge shotgun at a distance of less than 3 feet.
And somewhere out in there amongst those stumps is where Brian is alleged to, or has stated that he shot Mike Williams and killed him.
This wasn't part of the plan. Brian couldn't leave Mike's body in the water with a gunshot wound. He had to cover his tracks.
He said he drug him back up to the hill. They were on 2 separate vehicles. He backed his vehicle down here and loaded him up into the back of his vehicle.
Brian Winchester then put him in the back of his Suburban in a dog crate.
He then took the boat and drove it around to where it was found. Then he walked to the shore, walked down the road back to his truck.
Brian knew there would be a search for Mike's remains. He made sure they wouldn't look in the right place.
In the afternoon, he took the body to Carr Lake and buried it in a shallow grave next to the waterside.
Brian is the star witness, and he says, yes, I pulled the trigger. But Denise was the mastermind. Denise was the one who came up with the idea. It was all about Denise.
Would the jury come to the conclusion that Brian had acted alone, or would they accept his claim that he'd been trapped into murder by a woman who knew exactly what she was doing?
Denise is the brains behind this operation. Denise had the forethought to obtain a life insurance policy. She had the well-being enough to think about declaring Mike dead before his body is found. And who knows, if Denise had only been able to control her own selfishness, if she had stuck it out with Brian, perhaps Mike never would have been found. We often say there's nothing better than a scorned woman. I think it goes the same for men. Nothing better than a scorned man.
After 17 years without answers, justice, when it finally came, was swift.
The jury had been out approximately 8 hours, and we felt as the defense team that the case had not been proven, that Brian Winchester had admitted to being a murderer and being a liar. So we were surprised. It's almost like a gut punch to have something like that happen when they come back and say, guilty.
The jury believed Brian's account. It was Denise who masterminded the murder.
Brian's story is very likely, and the jury believes so too. And Denise Williams is convicted on all charges: conspiracy to commit murder and accessory after the fact, and she's sentenced to life in prison.
To investigator Derek Wester, it was the only possible outcome.
As soon as I heard that they had found his remains, I knew that eventually they was going to arrest her.
To Judy Ho, expert forensic psychologist, it's not so clear-cut.
I think Brian clearly was somebody who was all about self-perseverance. And when he realized that he could probably get a better outcome if he just threw Denise under the bus, he really didn't hesitate in doing so. And I think that Brian is just as callous as Denise. I think that they're both calculating.
A toxic relationship made for murder.
I think maybe that was a draw that they had to each other, that they're quite similar. I think that he painted this picture that he was essentially a victim as well and was somehow relatively successful in that when he is a different type of mastermind in his own right.
Denise Williams was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for the murder of Mike Williams and for the fraudulent life insurance claim.